Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next keynote presentation. My name is Catherine King, and I'm the Director of the Business Data team here at Corinium. It's lovely to see you all attending today. For those of you who didn't join us earlier, please do remember to submit your questions into us via the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. And of course, use the chat functionality to share your thoughts on the content and interact with your fellow attendees. Now, with all of that said and done, we're going to be diving into a very interesting presentation all about AI governance, driving compliance, efficiency and outcomes with RBC Bank. It is my pleasure to welcome both Michael and Zain to the stage.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. I'm Michael Hind, and we have Zain with us. Let me just share my screens. So just first, some introductions of who we are. As I said, I'm Michael Hind. I work for IBM Research. I talk to a lot of customers about AI governance, and I also lead a project called Fact Sheets, which we'll probably talk about later on. Zain, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Zain Nasrullah. I'm a senior manager in RBC's Enterprise Model Risk Management team. I'm part of a group that validates machine learning models. And for those that might be unfamiliar, validation is doing an independent and comprehensive assessment to determine whether a model is fit to go into production or fit for use. So we cover the scope of pretty much everything from the business use down to the theory of the model. And that gives us pretty good insight into the model landscape in a financial institution. So I'm here today to provide a complementary perspective to Mike's. And I should probably add in as well that the views I'll be sharing are my own and are not directly that of RBC.
Great, thanks Zain. So this topic of AI governance is one that resonates a lot, and we'll get into the details in a second. I've spoken to probably on the order of maybe 3 dozen different enterprises over the last year, many of them in a financial space. I talked to them about AI bias and AI explainability and robustness to adversarial attacks. But the one that comes up, the one that resonates the most is how do I govern all of these things, all of these issues? And that's what we're going to focus on today. The way we're going to structure the section is we've done our introductions already in terms of who we are. And we wanted to go through the topics in sort of a somewhat coherent way, just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of, what is governance, why it's important, and so on. You can see the questions there. The real interesting part will probably get down to the last question, which what are some of the challenges? And Zain and I will share our perspectives. And then, of course, even more interesting will be to answer your questions you have and you can place into the chat.
Sounds good. Mike, I'll kick things off by asking you to maybe start us off by defining what is AI governance?
Great. Thanks, Zain. So governance in general usually implies some sort of control or some sort of oversight. It's not specific to AI, obviously. And so in the case of AI, there's a lot of concern about how the system is developed, how it's deployed, and how it's monitored with real traffic. And so AI governance is trying to get some level of control of that, to specify potentially some kind of policies and hopefully have those policies enforced. So moving on to the next question, now that we have a definition of AI governance, Zain, can you tell us why it's important and what's driving this importance?
Well, for starters, you have kind of basic business continuity. If anyone is developing anything in any organization, whether it's a model, whether it's software or a business process, they should be documenting what they're doing and ensuring that what they've developed is essentially reproducible. This mitigates your key person risk, and more importantly, it builds trust in the solution. If you know something is well documented, if you know it's been scrutinized, and all of this relevant information is easily accessible to people, you know that there is some evidence that due diligence has been done, so you're more willing to trust that solution. Beyond just business continuity, though, I would agree that the main function of governance is in risk management. All statistical models, whether they're AI or not, contain uncertainty, and uncertainty leads you to risks, which can result in adverse consequences or outcomes. Some examples of that could be if we lend money to a client based on something a model is telling us, if that client writes off, there's a financial loss for the bank. If we have a model which is found to be unfair, that's potential reputational damage for the bank. If we have an SLA with a client and we fail to meet that SLA, then we could potentially be subject to legal action. If a malicious attacker wants to attack the bank and get access to sensitive data, there's security breaches and privacy concerns. And then there's failing to comply with regulations. So, for example, there are lots of regulations around anti-money laundering, and making sure that models are compliant and meeting those regulations is an important part of the bank as well. So in short, governance's role is primarily to manage risk and to understand all of these different considerations.
Great, thanks.
With that being said, suppose you're an organization and you do establish a very strong governance framework. In the short term and kind of looking a bit forward, what are some of the benefits that you can expect to realize from doing that?
Right, so the first one is exactly what you were saying, is that trying to control that risk and mitigate that risk. And this can be important because maybe you're in a regulated industry, you have regulations you need to satisfy. And so one benefit would be to satisfy those regulations and certainly not go to jail, which is always a good thing. When you're talking about AI models, there's this concern because the model is not explicitly created by a human. It's learned from a data set. So the risk is even higher there because it could learn something bad that you don't want it to learn. And so that's why, a very important aspect of that is to control that sort of brand reputation. There's many articles in the press where some AI model has done something wrong and resulted in poor publicity for that brand. And what I'm seeing, and I think it's going to evolve, is if you go back, say, 2 decades ago, there was the emergence of governance of software, where you had a chief information officer created in many enterprises to be able to control how software was being developed because they wanted to get a better consistency, they wanted to learn best practices. And I think what you're going to see is the emergence of a chief AI officer, a similar kind of role. Right now that function typically lives in the chief data office or the chief risk office. But I think AI is got a lot of unique aspects to it that you'll see that happen. And a lot of what we focus on here is avoiding the bad news, which is always important. But there's an upside to this as well, is as you start to control more and more of these processes, in order to control them, you need to learn what's going on. I spoke to a firm who said, I'm sure I have 5 different models being developed in my enterprise that know nothing about each other to do the same thing. Sorry, 5 models to analyze, let's say, drift. And they wanted to know, chief risk officer wanted to know, where are these models and is one better than the other and why do I have these redundancies? So in order to control, you need to understand first. You need to have some kind of documentation, some kind of catalog, some way to control this information. And then from that, you can actually learn best practices and scale that out to others. So just like with software development, where we learned common processes for developing software well and testing software, I think you're going to see that emerge here as well. And you'll get some kind of consistency in learning best practices. You'll have policies like, we should check for bias at various points in the life cycle, and we should do it in a certain way, and so on. So you're going to see that consistency coming. And I think right now, it from what I hear, it seems to be a bit more ad hoc. But that is one of the benefits down the road.
Yeah, definitely. And could you talk a bit about who are the stakeholders today that are kind of involved in the model lifecycle?
Right. So this is an interesting question because quite often when we think about AI, most people think about, all right, there's the person that gets paid a lot of money, the data scientist, to create those models. And Zain already told us there's actually a very important other stakeholder. There's model validators that have been around for a while, even before AI, to understand the risk of models. So those are 2 important stakeholders. But it turns out there's more than that. It starts all the way at the beginning with the business owner who's is basically trying to create the request for the model. So the business owner has some problem. They want to do something more accurately, or they want to do something more efficiently, and they request that model. So they're certainly a stakeholder. And then on the other end of the life cycle, you've got the operations person. That when the model gets deployed, somebody's managing it. Someone needs to know, if I see some behavior, is this good or bad? Is this expected that the model is going to drift in a certain way or not? Or maybe I'm seeing biased behavior, and so on. And so those are the stakeholders that are part of the whole process. But then you have other stakeholders that are equally important. You have a chief risk officer who's looking at the whole process. You've got a person maybe in legal that's talking to regulators or And then you've got the affected users, the consumers, of course. And a lot of the stuff you see in the press is affected users who were affected in a bad way. And so they should have a role in all of this. So Zain, that kind of lays out the land here. Can you give us sort of a summary of where things are today? I mean, this exists in places today. And so from your experience, how are all these processes implemented today?
Yeah, so I wanted to give a high-level overview of how we do it at RBC, and this is very, very high level. So it kind of starts out, like you said, with a business unit. They have some sort of problem which needs to be solved. They commission a model development team. That team goes and constructs a model or develop a model. When they're making that model, they have to adhere to RBC's policies. So we have a model risk policy that they're required to follow. And to ensure that they are actually following that policy, we have a standardized template for documentation that they have to fill out. This is a very long and comprehensive document that makes sure basically a development team is aware of all the model risks and are documenting the right things. Once they're done that process, they've developed the model and they've documented everything. They submit it through an inventory management system, and then that flows over to our team. So our team receives their submission. We put together a plan to then validate that model and assign to it a risk rating, which basically will denote the level of testing we want to perform. Our role in validation is really to come into this model, to review the documentation, make sure it's complete. In addition to that, we need to make sure the documentation is actually accurate or that it's correct and conceptually sound. And then beyond that, we want to challenge the model. So what did the development team do and what haven't they done? What sort of tests can we run to identify weaknesses or failure points in the model so we can give feedback back to the model development teams to improve their models? Once we're done our part, we summarize everything into a validation report, which includes a list of issues. Some of those are critical issues that need to be fixed before the model actually goes into production. The rest are kind of lower severity issues. They can be addressed while the model is in production within an agreed remediation timeline. Once the validation report is done, we take it to some of the stakeholders. So we take it to the model developers and the business unit. We discuss the issues and make sure we have consensus agreement over everything. Once that process is done, we take it through a more comprehensive approval process, which involves some of the executive stakeholders. So in the business units, also in model risk, also considering the model users, people have to be aware that this is the model as it's documented. Here's the validation report. Here are our findings. And once everything has been formally and rigorously approved, it gets logged in the inventory management system as being approved. And during this entire process, all of the metadata and artifacts are also stored there, so they're accessible to anyone who wants access to these things. And we can also, provide access to a regulator or to audit if they want to look at some of these artifacts to kind of review what we did. Once the model goes into production, the development team is responsible for monitoring or executing the monitoring strategy on the model, making sure it continues to operate as expected. They're also responsible for resolving the issues that we laid out. And they are supposed to periodically report in to governance and to the validation team to give us updates on any changes. And if they plan to update the model or retrain the model or change something, they need to notify us and get us involved in that process as well. Finally, on a periodic basis, we might come back and revisit the model, and that's usually done in accordance with its model risk rating. So if you have a higher risk model, you probably want to come back and revisit it, revalidate it on a more frequent basis than something which is lower risk. A couple of quick insights based on this governance framework I've laid out. This kind of points back to some of the earlier points you made, which was that very few AI models that we have deployed across the bank are completely autonomous. In most cases, there's a human in the loop. So models produce outputs, they produce scores, they produce predictions. These go to people. People review their predictions and then make some sort of business decision off of the model outputs. So we're not quite at the point where you have total model autonomy. One misconception with this is people feel that having a human in the loop just removes all model risk altogether, and that's not true. The idea here is that the model is serving a prediction, and the person who is consuming that prediction, they don't know whether the model is correct or not. They just have to trust that it's correct. So any decision the human makes still is subject to the same uncertainty that the model was subject to. So those risks aren't gone. You've just added an additional safeguard. Beyond that, you also mentioned before that model risk predated the popularity of AI. And there are a couple of considerations which are unique to AI, ways in which machine learning models kind of differ from traditional financial and statistical models. So some of those are that machine learning models tend to be more complex. By that, I mean they tend to have more parameters, they have more hyperparameters, and they also have more modeling assumptions. So you need to do more analysis to make sure all of the above is actually correct. But they do tend to follow more standard structures. So in our sphere, you have kind of your ensemble methods, you have your deep learning methods. They follow relatively straightforward standardized structures. So there is some level of consistency there. The implementations are also getting far more complex. Not only are data sizes much larger than they used to be in the past, code bases are also much larger than they used to be in the past. And we're kind of going more towards a territory where model development is looking more like software engineering. And there's more emphasis that's being given to ML ops. And you can see that over time, the code is definitely getting more sophisticated. And finally, I would say there's a larger reliance on algorithmic techniques as opposed to expert judgment. In the past, with linear regression, you would have experts kind of making domain-driven decisions. Nowadays, if you want to do something with feature selection, it's more common to put a lot of features into the model and then use some sort of algorithmic technique to reduce that feature set down to size. So there's definitely been a shift in priorities or in the way in which the models are developed. And that kind of begs the question, do we need to change the way we're governing the models since there's a change in how they're actually being developed? Which leads into my next question to you, Mike, which is specifically around the topic of documentation. So I'm a little biased because I work on the risk side, and for me, having very comprehensive documentation is very good, because that makes my job a lot easier. That being said, I'm very sympathetic for model developers because they have to write a lot of documentation, and it's very difficult to justify everything that you've done and document everything correctly. So there's kind of inherent trade-off over here between producing good documentation and investing an appropriate amount of time into producing the documentation. What are your thoughts as someone who has worked across industries with many different people on the topic of documentation?
Yes. So first of all, as a lifelong programmer, I understand the value of writing comments and things like that. But I was really blown away when I got introduced to this space at the level of documentation. We're talking, some companies have over 100 pages of documentations. I've heard one financial firm doesn't want their data scientists spending their time writing documentation, so they will outsource that to have people come in to document the models that they didn't write, which could raise a question in terms of how the quality of those models. And I guess the other thing was something that you and I shared. When we at IBM, we created this Fact Sheets 360 website with a lot of information about the Fact Sheets project and AI governance in general. And one of the things we did is we put down example fact sheets. So a fact sheet, if you're not familiar, is basically a document that describes everything about the construction of the model. And we gave some examples, and we did this internally. We're not a financial firm, so we had people who created models document those models. And we decided to push really, really hard to make them as high quality as possible. And I thought we were overkill. And then Zain, you and I had a conversation where you gave us excellent feedback on that. And then if anything, you were asking for more information. So it's amazing. If you haven't looked at this space, it's amazing at the level of documentation that's required for good reasons, because as you said before, why do we want to have governance? Because of all the risk and the bad things that can happen financially and so on. So this is all for a good thing, but it does raise the challenge of how do we help the data scientist who really wants to spend the time coming up with a more accurate model and doesn't want to necessarily write a lot of stuff. How can we help them do that? And so one of the things that we're doing as part of the Fact Sheet project, and also that's just been announced as a new offering by IBM later this year, is to be able to document as much as possible automatically. So the idea is, as you're going through the life cycle of constructing AI that we mentioned before, the various personas know things. They're interacting with tools to either write those things down or the tools produce that information. And if we could record that information, capture that information, then that information is then available to everyone in the life cycle, including the stakeholders outside the life cycle. So that's one of the ways we're trying to address this important issue. And there's more information on our website for that. So let me move to the next challenging question. There's an infinite number of challenging questions for those in the audience. I'm sure we'll get some in the Q&A. But I think we have time for just one more. And that's, you touched on it a little bit before in terms of, in a different way, the sort of old original models, and then there's new AI models. But there's if you go, you drop down a level to AI models, there's the sort of more traditional techniques and new modeling approaches. And I'm wondering if you could share your experience on what you're seeing and what are the challenges there.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a perception that kind of the tried and tested traditional models or architectures are a bit more, I want to say, safer to use. They're less risky than going with something that's black box or something that's very complicated. Especially in a banking context, we see our model developers trying to tend towards those sort of solutions. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think it's very important for model developers to explore the entire space of solutions. So definitely develop the simple baselines and try the tried and tested techniques if you want to use random forest or XGBoost or your traditional ensemble techniques. But then also try something that's totally out there. Go grab a paper from like 2020, 2021. Try a completely new novel technique and just see how well it performs, just to get an understanding of where your performance lies in the total space. Just to give a more concrete example, let's say you're working on a natural language problem and someone develops a model that's just based off of counting word frequencies. That's very easy to explain to people. If I brought that to the ordinary model users, this is someone who's not even technical, they would understand counting words. That seems like something that's fairly intuitive, and the presence of certain words can lead to different outcomes. It's very easy to explain to someone. If you start talking about developing language models with transformers, now if you take this to the average person, you've totally lost them. They've heard the term transformers in the context of maybe electrical circuits or Michael Bay movies. They haven't really thought about transformers as an attention mechanism for machine learning. So you can understand why model developers are very apprehensive about going for these more sophisticated solutions. What we found in internal use cases where model developers have ventured out the green path and have kind of tried unique and interesting things, they found that some of these transformer-based architectures for natural language problems are offering substantial boosts in performance. Now, that's not to say they're perfect. They're not. They have their unique weaknesses and trade-offs. And what's important is trying to understand those, to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different techniques, and not always going for the model which is necessarily more interpretable or perceived to be more interpretable. Because just because you have an explanation, if your model is performing twice as badly as state of the art, then so what if you have the explanation? You're probably causing more harm than you're doing good. So I think people need to maybe branch out a bit. And there's a tremendous amount of work that's right now being done in like graph-based neural network architectures, a lot of work on computer vision and NLP. There are hundreds of papers coming out every year, tremendous number of great ideas. And I'd like to see more people tap into those things.
Great. So I think we've got about 5 minutes left for Q&A. I'll turn it over to the host, Catherine.
You do indeed. And what I will say is definitely don't go rushing these answers, because what is fantastic is you're both going to be in the speaker meet and greet later today. So let's go for maybe one or two in depth, that we could save the rest for later. But thank you to the audience members who have sent those in. And if you haven't sent them in yet, as I say, they'll be in the speaker meet and greet later today. So Ram has written in, thank you very much, Ram, and has asked, thanks for the great intro. Would it be possible to speak about the tools that are being used for AI governance? We heard about Fairlearn. Wondering if there are any tools speakers recommend, and how do you guys go about validating/using them?
So I'll jump in first. We have actually 3 open source tools in this space. We have AI Fairness 360, AI Explainability 360, and AI Adversarial Robustness 360. They're all linkable from the Fact Sheets 360 webpage, and they address the obvious things. They're all open source. IBM also has a product called OpenScale, and the open refers to the fact that it could be used to model any, it could be used to monitor any model produced on any platform for a bias and also for explainability and drift. So there's information about that. Zain, you want to?
Yeah, and from RBC's context, we have a very mature governance framework right now, and we use that to manage all of our models. So these are AI models and traditional financial models. but we're looking into ways in which we can always enhance our processes and improve the tools that we're using. We leverage whatever we can to do the best job that we can do. So we leverage IBM's tools, we leverage our in-house tools for doing the tests for robustness, for fairness, uncertainty quantification, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of potential, I think, right now to improve our existing processes, but we have a fairly good framework today.
Super, thank you both so much. And just a reminder, of course, you can find out much more about IBM and their solutions if you visit the content hub on the platform. And don't forget, the attendee directory is a fantastic resource as well to directly connect with Michael and Zain to ask more about that. But Ram, I hope that has added value to you. Or I reckon we can squeeze in another question. I'll be cheeky. Kevin has written in and asked, how are things like intelligent automation impacting the ability to check accuracy of data, but also checks the governance frameworks?
So in general, the governance idea is to be able to capture the model, the information about building the model, regardless of what the model is doing. And so at some point, so it's sort of independent of the use case, but should be tailored to the use case, right? So if you have a situation where a model is predicting mechanical defect failures, you probably don't care too much about human bias in that case. If it's a model that's going to be behind a firewall, maybe you don't care too much about adversaries attacking it. And so it needs to be customized to a particular use case. And so I think that intelligent automation, it would certainly fit in the idea that the risks may be different, but you want to be able to capture the information you care about. And one of the things on the website is we have a detailed section on methodology, so how to create a fact sheet, and it basically goes through a process, a 7-step process to sort of help you ask questions about, well, what's important to me? How do I know what risks are important, and to bring the stakeholders together?
I'll probably add a little bit as well. If I'm interpreting the question correctly, it's around how we can use automation to improve some of the processes that we're doing today in terms of like data profiling and choosing which tests to run and how to govern the model. We are currently working with our research branch, Borealis AIs, to develop tools to kind of explore the space of a model, to explore the data from a more rigorous perspective. I don't have much I can say on that right now, but in the future, we are basically looking at ways in which we can try to automate aspects of the validation and governance process to the best of our ability.
Super. Thank you both so much. Again, Kevin, I hope that has added value to you. Anna, thank you for sending in your question, but rather than squeeze it into the 30 seconds I have now, let's move that over to the 5:15 speaker meet and greet, where I'm sure Michael and Zain will be more than happy to dive deep into that question you've sent us. Thank you both so much for that presentation. It was absolutely brilliant.